Envision yourself as a 12-year-old child in a remote Bulgarian hamlet during 1550. Dawn fog embraces the hillsides like a burial shroud while you assist your father with the flock. The chimes dangling from their necks produce a soft symphony that has accompanied every moment of your existence. Your mother prepares the morning meal, fresh bread and goat's milk that embodies comfort, security, and all you've ever experienced. Suddenly you detect it, the pounding of horse hooves on stone pathways. Your father's complexion turns ashen. Your mother releases the ceramic vessel in her grasp, and it breaks apart on the ground just as your reality is about to fracture. Every villager understands the meaning of those galloping sounds. The emperor's tax collectors have arrived. You observe from behind a timber wagon as Ottoman representatives climb down from their mounts, their fine garments immaculate despite their lengthy trek. They bear documents and rosters, their gaze sweeping across the assembled townspeople with the detached assessment of traders appraising cattle. When one gestures straight towards you, your mother crumbles to the earth, pleading in words they refuse to comprehend. Your father remains motionless, understanding that defiance equals execution for his whole household. You are dragged away with assurances that you'll serve the emperor, that you'll achieve distinction, that this represents privilege. But as the wagon departs from all you've ever experienced, the only sound reaching your ears is your mother's weeping, growing fainter with distance. You'll never encounter her again. This marked the start of your existence as a court servant, a gulam within the mightiest empire on the planet. The nightmares awaiting you within those palace chambers would make you yearn for those humble days herding livestock in the fog-covered hills of your birthplace. Before exploring these lost tales of endurance and anguish, if you appreciate discovering history's concealed truths, consider pressing that like button and subscribing for similar content. Please share in the comments where you're watching from. I find it remarkable that we're examining these ancient narratives together from various corners of the globe, united across time and space by our mutual fascination with the past. The trek to Istanbul provided your initial experience of the methodical brutality that would characterize your new reality. You and scores of other children were forced to march for weeks across harsh landscape, poorly nourished, sleeping outdoors or in makeshift shelters offering minimal protection from weather. The frail ones, those unable to maintain pace, who became sick or who simply abandoned hope, were abandoned to perish. You absorbed your first lesson in Ottoman court existence before even reaching the capital. Frailty meant death, and only the most resilient, cunning, or flexible would endure what lay ahead. The child marching alongside you, perhaps 14 years old, had been seized from a Greek coastal village. His name was Nikos, though he whispered that soon that identity would be forbidden. He had attempted flight on the third evening of the journey, but guards captured him before he traveled a mile. They hauled him back to camp and struck him before all the other children as instruction. His cries rang across the landscape, and you pressed your eyes closed, trying to shut out the sound, but you couldn't block the message. Escape was impossible. Defiance was pointless. By the time you reached Istanbul's outskirts, you had mastered moving like a spectre, speaking only when addressed, making yourself invisible when guards' attention turned threatening. You had witnessed children vanish in darkness, some who attempted escape, others who simply couldn't bear another day. Their vacant positions in formation served as constant reminders of your own fragility. The initial glimpse of Istanbul's skyline should have been magnificent, the minarets piercing the heavens, Hagia Sophia's enormous dome, the vast palace complex that would become your prison. But all you experienced was hollow dread settling in your stomach like stone. This splendid city represented everything you had lost and everything you feared becoming. Upon reaching Istanbul, you confronted your first selection. Ottoman officials separated surviving children into groups based on perceived potential. The process was degrading and comprehensive. They examined your teeth like livestock, tested reflexes, made you recite your limited knowledge of letters and numbers. They measured height, inspected skin for imperfections, and evaluated facial features with clinical detachment of art assessors. The most attractive and intelligent were destined for palace education. The Enderun, others would join the Janissaries, the elite military force. But for those selected for palace service, a different trial awaited, one testing not just physical endurance but your soul's capacity to survive systematic dehumanization. You were among the chosen ones selected for Enderun School, housed within Topkapi Palace walls. The officials making this choice observed your clear complexion, bright eyes, and obvious intelligence, and they smiled. You didn't comprehend then that their smiles weren't kind. They were predators' grins who had discovered particularly promising prey. The Enderun School has been termed the world's first institutionalized education for the gifted. This description, while technically accurate, conceals the darker reality of what education meant for displaced children like you. Yes, you would master languages, Arabic, Persian, Turkish. You would study mathematics, astronomy, literature, law. You would train in music, calligraphy, various crafts. But this education demanded a price extending far beyond academic rigor. The palace complex, becoming your world, was a labyrinth of marble passages, ornate chambers, and concealed corridors where danger lurked everywhere. You were housed in dormitories within the complex, separated from the outside world by layers of walls, guards, and protocol, making escape not just difficult, but inconceivable. The dormitory where you would sleep stretched before you like a marble tomb, lined with narrow beds covered in silk that felt like shackles against your skin. Your first night, you lay awake, listening to sounds that would become your imprisonment soundtrack. Soft sobbing of homesick children trying to muffle tears in pillows, whispered conversations in unrecognized languages, footsteps of older students and supervisors prowling halls after lights out. You clutched the small wooden cross your mother had pressed into your hand as you were taken, but by morning, even that final connection to your former life would be discovered and confiscated. You received a new name, Mehmet, and were told to forget your Christian origin. Conversion to the empire's official faith wasn't optional. It was fundamental to your transformation from captured child into Ottoman servant. The ceremony was conducted with great ceremony, as if you had chosen this path voluntarily. But you knew, everyone knew, that choice had nothing to do with it. You repeated the words they commanded, but inside you clung to memories of your mother's lullabies and father's stories. But the most insidious aspect of your education was systematic breakdown of individual will and reconstruction as an instrument of imperial pleasure and power. The palace operated on complex hierarchy where advancement depended not just on academic achievement, but on your ability to please superiors, and pleasing could take many forms no child should ever learn. Your first lesson in the palace's unspoken rules came from Ahmet, an older student in the system for 3 years. He approached you one evening in the dormitory, his voice carrying both threat and promise. "You're new," he said, settling onto your bed's edge, uninvited. "You don't understand how things work here yet, but I can protect you, teach you, help you advance. The teachers favor me and they listen to my recommendations about younger boys." He let his hand rest on your shoulder, and you felt yourself freeze. You were 12 years old and had never been touched by a stranger, but something in his manner made your skin crawl. "In return," he continued, voice dropping to whisper, "you would need to show gratitude. There are ways boys like you can thank older students for protection, special ways that stay between us. You faced an impossible choice thousands of boys before you had faced: refuse and risk brutal punishment, social isolation, and end of any advancement hope. Accept and surrender childhood innocence's last vestiges to a system viewing your body as commodity to be traded for favor and protection. There was no good choice, only survival." The palace's sexual ecosystem was complex and predatory, operating according to rules established over generations of exploitation. Eunuchs, castrated as boys themselves and often bearing psychological scars, wielded considerable power and used it to exploit the constant stream of new arrivals. They understood the system intimately because they had once been its victims, but rather than protecting newcomers, many became its most enthusiastic enforcers. Older students preyed on younger ones, perpetuating abuse cycles stretching back generations. It was twisted hazing where the initiated earned hierarchy placement by victimizing those below them. Palace officials exploited their positions to access the most beautiful boys with impunity, knowing victims had no recourse and no one to appeal for justice. What made this system particularly insidious was its integration with official palace hierarchy. Sexual relationships weren't hidden scandals, they were part of social order, woven into daily life so completely they seemed natural and inevitable. Boys catching powerful patrons' eyes could find careers accelerated, studies easier, lives more comfortable. Those refusing or displeasing superiors found themselves relegated to menial positions, subjected to harsher discipline, or simply disappeared from palace roles altogether. The psychological impact on children like you was devastating and carefully calculated. Cut off from family, stripped of original identity, thrust into a world where your body was seen as commodity, you developed what we might now recognize as complex trauma responses. Some boys became manipulative and calculating, learning to use sexuality as advancement and survival tool. Others withdrew into themselves, becoming hollow shells going through palace life motions while their spirits died inside. You watched both transformations happen to boys around you. Dmitri, taken from your same region, learned to smile and flirt with older students and teachers. Within 6 months he had new clothes, better food, and private language tutor. But his eyes had gone dead, and he no longer spoke of home or family. When new boys arrived, he looked at them with the same calculating gaze officials had once turned on him. Stephanos, a Greek fisherman's son, took the opposite path. He refused all advances, endured beatings and punishment, and gradually faded into ghost-like existence. He performed duties mechanically, studied adequately but without enthusiasm, and seemed to disappear a little more each day. One morning his bed was empty, and no one ever mentioned his name again. You tried finding a middle path, accepting some advances to survive while maintaining some core of yourself that remained untouched. But the palace was designed to make such compromise impossible. Every day brought new tests, new choices between degradation and destruction, new ways the system sought to remake you in its own image. European travelers who visited the Ottoman court occasionally glimpsed this hidden world, though their accounts were often filtered through cultural biases and limited understanding. A 16th century Venetian ambassador noted the excessive fondness palace officials showed for young male servants, describing scenes that made him uncomfortable in the extreme. He wrote of seeing boys as young as 10 or 11 dressed in silk and jewels, attending to older men with familiarity, suggesting relationships going far beyond appropriate master-servant dynamics. A French diplomat in the 17th century wrote more explicitly about what he witnessed during a palace reception. The young pages moved through halls like beautiful birds in cages, their eyes downcast but bodies adorned for display. One cannot help but notice the possessive manner in which certain officials regard these children, nor the fear that flickers in boys' eyes when their masters approach. Physical conditions of palace life compounded psychological abuse in ways designed to break down resistance and create dependency. You lived in cramped dormitories with minimal privacy, where every moment was subject to surveillance and control. You were awakened before dawn for prayers you had been forced to learn, fed adequate but not abundant meals at precise times, and subjected to rigid schedules leaving no time for reflection or resistance. Punishments were common and creatively designed to humiliate and break spirits. Boys violating rules, speaking native languages, practicing old traditions, or showing insufficient enthusiasm for new lives faced beatings, public humiliation, or isolation in chambers barely large enough to lie down in. You witnessed a boy named Milos caught praying in his former faith's manor, forced to stand naked in the courtyard for an entire day, while other students were encouraged to mock him. The lesson was clear. Your old identity wasn't just forbidden, it was a source of shame. The palace's internal economy further complicated your situation and created additional exploitation layers. You could earn small privileges through good behavior, academic achievement, or pleasing superiors in various ways. These privileges, better food, nicer clothing, more comfortable sleeping arrangements, access to books or musical instruments, became precious commodities in your restricted world. The system created complex webs of dependencies and loyalties, making resistance nearly impossible, and collaboration seemed like the only path to survival. You learned navigating this economy with calculating mind of someone much older than your years. You discovered that helping older students with studies could earn protection from their advances. You found that showing particular aptitude in certain subjects could gain teachers' attention, who might shield you from worst abuses. You realized that perfect obedience and visible enthusiasm for your new life could result in small freedoms that felt enormous in your circumscribed world. Some boys attempted escape, but the palace's location on a peninsula surrounded by water made this extremely difficult. Those caught faced severe punishment deliberately made public to deter others. You witnessed the return of a boy who had tried fleeing by swimming across the Golden Horn. He was barely alive when they dragged him back, and the beating he received in front of all students left him permanently injured. He lived as a warning to the rest of you, being broken, barely functional, a living example of what happened to those choosing rebellion over submission. The few boys managing to flee faced even more daunting challenges. They had been in the palace so long, their original identities so thoroughly erased, that returning to former lives was impossible. Their families might not recognize them, their communities might reject them as traitors or converts, and they possessed few skills allowing survival outside the palace system. Most who escaped were recaptured within days, but even those remaining free often found themselves adrift in a world no longer having a place for them. As you matured within the system, surviving through intelligence, adaptability, and carefully calculated submission, you faced new challenges and deeper corruption of your soul. The most successful students might eventually be appointed to high governmental positions, but this success came at the cost of perpetuating the very system that had abused them. You realized with growing horror that your teachers and supervisors, the men who had shaped and damaged you, had once been boys like you, taken from families and molded into instruments of imperial power. This recognition brought a terrible choice. You could resist the system and likely be destroyed by it, or embrace it fully and become one of its enforcers, selecting the next generation of boys, breaking them down and rebuilding them, maintaining the palace's hierarchies of power and exploitation. Many boys chose the latter path, finding it easier to become predators than remain prey indefinitely. The graduation ceremony, known as chukma, marked the end of your palace education and entry into imperial service. After years of systematic abuse disguised as education, you emerged as a young man fluent in multiple languages, skilled in administration and diplomacy, trained in arts and sciences. But you also emerged as someone whose soul had been systematically corrupted, whose understanding of power was forever intertwined with exploitation, whose capacity for normal human relationships had been damaged in ways that might never heal. For many graduates, this transition simply meant moving from one form of exploitation to another. Those appointed to administrative positions found themselves in a world where sexual favors and political advancement remained intertwined, where lessons learned in the palace about power, submission, and survival continued shaping their adult lives. Those assigned to military roles carried with them psychological scars of their palace years, often becoming either brutal enforcers of imperial will or broken men who struggled to find meaning in lives built on foundations of abuse. The Ottoman elite's attitude toward these practices was complex and carefully constructed to maintain the system while denying its most disturbing aspects. While official regulations prohibited many forms of abuse, the reality was that palace authorities turned a blind eye to behaviors serving their interests. The system produced capable administrators and loyal servants, which was its primary purpose. The human cost was considered irrelevant to its success, and any criticism was dismissed as ignorance of the empire's sophisticated methods of education and advancement. Contemporary Ottoman writers sometimes acknowledged the system's darker aspects while defending its overall value. A 16th-century court historian wrote, "It is true that the palace school demands great sacrifices from its students, and that not all who enter emerge unchanged, but from this crucible of discipline and learning emerge the finest servants of the empire, men whose loyalty has been tested and whose capabilities have been honed to perfection." This rhetoric of transformation and improvement masked the reality of what boys like you experienced. Your testing involved systematic sexual abuse, your discipline involved destruction of your original identity and construction of a new self designed to serve imperial interests. Your learning came at the cost of childhood innocence and capacity for normal human relationships. What makes the Ottoman palace system particularly disturbing is how it combined genuine educational opportunities with systematic abuse in ways making it difficult to separate benefits from horrors. Boys did receive education that was, by the era's standards, exceptionally advanced. You learned to read and write in languages opening doors throughout the known world. You studied sciences and mathematics that were cutting edge for their time. You gained skills in diplomacy, administration, and military strategy that would serve you throughout life. But this education was inseparable from your exploitation and abuse. The same teachers who expanded your mind also violated your body. The same system giving you opportunities also destroyed your innocence. The same institution promising advancement also ensured that advancement would forever be tainted by the methods used to achieve it. The system also reveals the complex relationship between power, sexuality, and violence in pre-modern societies. The Ottomans were not unique in their exploitation of young people. Similar practices existed in various forms throughout ancient and medieval worlds, but the Ottoman system was notable for its scale, systematization, and integration into the imperial apparatus. It was not a hidden perversion, but an open institution, celebrated for its effectiveness and defended by its beneficiaries. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the palace system began declining as changing military technologies reduced janissary corps importance, and new administrative forms decreased reliance on palace-trained bureaucrats. European influence and changing social attitudes also contributed to the system's gradual transformation. But for thousands of boys who passed through palace gates during the system's height, these changes came far too late. Their stories of childhood lost, innocence destroyed, and spirits broken in service to imperial power represent one of history's most systematic examples of institutional child abuse. The boys who survived learned to navigate a world where their beauty was both asset and liability, where their intelligence was valued but their humanity was not, where advancement required surrendering pieces of their souls that could never be recovered. Some rose to positions of great power and influence, becoming viziers, generals, and governors who shaped the empire's destiny, but they carried with them the scars of their palace years, and many perpetuated the cycles of abuse that had shaped them. Others disappeared into historical obscurity, their fates unknown and suffering unrecorded, remembered only as entries in administrative records noting their arrival, training, and eventual assignment to service. The palace walls that once echoed with these boys' footsteps still stand today, transformed into a museum where tourists admire the architectural grandeur and artistic treasures of the Ottoman court. Visitors marvel at the beautiful chambers where the empire's elite were educated, but they see only the physical beauty of the spaces. The marble corridors keep their darkest secrets, and the rooms where education and exploitation intertwined remain silent about the price that generations of young boys paid for imperial glory. The guided tours speak of the palace school's educational innovations, its role in training capable administrators, its contribution to the empire's success. They do not mention the systematic abuse fundamental to its operation, the boys who died rather than submit to its demands, or the men who emerged from its halls forever changed by their experiences within its walls. As I finish this account, imagining your story as representative of thousands like it, I'm reminded that these tales of suffering and survival are not merely historical curiosities. They represent real human beings, children torn from families, stripped of identities, and forced to navigate a world that valued their bodies and minds while dismissing their humanity as irrelevant to the empire's grand designs. You, the boy I've imagined standing in those marble corridors with fear in your heart and silence on your lips, represent thousands of real children whose names we will never know, whose individual stories were never recorded, whose suffering was never acknowledged by the system that created and sustained it. Your ghost and the ghosts of all boys like you still walk those palace halls, reminding us that behind every empire's grandeur lies a foundation built on human suffering, and that the price of power is often paid by those who have no choice in the matter. The horror was not in the violence alone, but in how systematically it was applied, how completely it was normalized, and how thoroughly it was forgotten by history. You and boys like you lived and died in a system that treated you as beautiful objects to be molded and used, and your stories deserve to be remembered, not as exotic historical footnotes, but as testimonies to human resilience in the face of institutionalized cruelty. The morning air that once carried your fearful footsteps has long since faded, but your story echoes still through time, demanding that we bear witness to your suffering and remember the terrible price of the empire's golden age. In remembering your story, we honor not just your individual suffering, but the suffering of all children who have been caught in the machinery of power throughout history, used and discarded by systems that value conquest over compassion, empire over innocence.